Hello. In this video, I will be discussing Worlds 2015 and summarizing it for you. First of all, one thing to note is that this would be the first Worlds to be played on the new map, so the games will look a little bit different to you if you've been following along. So the second thing to think about is that this was the first Worlds following the big Korean exodus to China. So a lot of the Korean players from the 2014 World Championship, the best Korean players, had gone to China immediately following that and had been playing in China for the year of 2015. Examples are Pawn and Deft, who went to EDG. In fact, Pawn and Deft were actually able to win China's first international tournament when they took down Skt at the mid-season invitational. Let's jump into the specific team going into this World Championships. Leading up to Worlds 2015, Skt were the heavy favourites, as they had won spring and summer in the LCK. In summer, they won both the regular season and the playoff. They narrowly lost MSI to to EDG, out of China, as I said. However, EDG had lost two not very close series in the LPL summer playoffs. Skt, on the other hand, had swept KT 3-0 to qualify as the first seed from Korea. So we're kind of in a state where the only legitimate challenger to Skt that we'd seen outside of Korea was sort of falling by the wayside in China. So Skt were very much the heavy favourites coming into the tournament. KT and Ku were seen as big threats in the tournament as well, but both huge underdogs to Skt, as Skt had sort of bodied them domestically. LGD and IG from China were dark horse candidates for the tournament, as some sort of were throwing around the logic, not that I agree with this, but some were throwing around the logic that they'd beaten EDG, and EDG had beaten SKT, so maybe they were going to do work at the tournament. So there was also a lot of hype around Fnatic, who had just come off a perfect 18-0 regular season. They were challenged in a close series by Origin in the finals, but this just made European fans even more confident in their teams. Because of that series, Origin also had some big hopes behind them for this Worlds. Nobody was particularly hyped for H2K. CLG had looked strong domestically coming into Worlds, but very few people believed that they would actually be a legitimate international threat. Hope was also low for TSM. Cloud9 was coming off a crazy gauntlet win with a couple of reverse sweeps. Cloud9 had actually been 7th in the regular season and had managed to come through the gauntlet and actually qualify for Worlds. So people were wondering if the underdog story was going to continue. Ahq and Flashwolves out of LMS, people weren't really talking about them too much, but they definitely ended up making a little bit of a splash at this Worlds. Worlds kicked off with Fnatic smashing IG so hard they surrendered. And then 8 days of groups followed that, and I'll just quickly talk you through those results. So, in Group A, our qualifying teams are Flash Wolves and the Ku Tigers, each with a score of 4 and 2. However, Flash Wolves took it without having to do a tiebreaker because they had a 2-0 score over the Ku Tigers. Non-qualifying teams were Canalogic Gaming, CLG, with a score of 2 and 4, and Pain Gaming also with a score of 2 and 4. Group B, our qualifying teams are Fnatic with a score of 4 and 2, Ahq with a score of 3 and 3, Cloud9 did not qualify, they also had a score of 3 and 3, but they lost a tiebreaker to Ahq, and Invictus Gaming with a score of 2 and 4. So notably here, Cloud9 started 3 and 0, and so all they had to do was win a single game, but instead they lost 4 games in a row, including all 3 scheduled games and then the tiebreaker to Ahq. And also notably here, Invictus Gaming not qualifying is very interesting because they were the second seed out of China, and China was looking quite strong this season. But yeah, Invictus Gaming did not qualify, a score of 2 and 4. Worse than the score of Cloud9. So then we move into Group C, Skt qualifying with a perfect score of 6 and 0. EDG qualifying 4 and 2. So people were quite interested to see that Skt easily 2-0'd EDG in these groups, perhaps putting to rest some of the fears the Korean fans might have had about China following MSI. H2K did not qualify, they had a score of 2 and 4, and finally the Bangkok Titans from Southeast Asia with a score of 0 and 6. We move into Group D, where KT Rolster was able to go 5 and 1. Qualifying, and Origin came in with a score of 4 and 2. LGD, the first seed out of China, this team that had beaten EDG and then beaten Invictus Gaming and then beaten EDG, did not qualify and with a score of 2 and 4. So this was a very disappointing performance. The only Chinese team making out of groups being EDG. So TSM's score of 1 and 5, the only victory TSM were able to find was against LGD. So at least they were able to take down China's #1 seed, but other than that, not much going on for TSM. Therefore, our quarterfinals matchups were as follows: Flash Wolves versus Origin, Skt versus Ahq, Fnatic versus EDG, and KT versus Ku. So the first quarterfinal to be played was Origin versus Flash Wolves. Game 1 was close and was actually going against Origin, but Origin clinched the game with sneaking a Baron, and then Soaz was able to get a pentakill when Flash Wolves tried to fight it. Then they finally finished the game with a beautiful base sneak whilst behind the Flash Wolves' back. Origin took game 2 off the back of Neil's, brackets, that's Sven, Sven's Kalista, supported by Soaz's Lulu. Flash Wolves struck back in game 3 with some crazy early game dives. However, Neil's Jinx paired with Soaz's Lulu clinched Game 4 for Origin and a spot in the semi-finals. Notably, Xpeke was on Anivia for most of the series. And yes, Neil's really played well in this series. So that's, you would know him as Sven today from Cloud9, but back in the day he was OG Niels. So, my next series was Ku versus KT. So this series was casted by Doa, Jat, and Monty, which is kind of a casting dream threesome there, so definitely very enjoyable to listen to. So this series had some insane close team fights. Vidarius from Someday carried Game 1 for KT. There was a very close Game 2. Smeb's Fiora and Kuro's Veigar mid were able to really make a splash. Game 3 would be much more Ku favoured, with Smeb again on Fiora. And KT really picked no damage in that Game 3, so I'm not really sure what they were hoping for. And then finally, we get into Game 4, where Kuro's Victor carries them, and praise Caitlyn was definitely doing some work there as well. Arrow was playing an amazing Jinx, but it was not enough to save KT. So the third semi-final was EDG versus Fnatic, which Fnatic won easily 3-0. So some of the games went a bit longer, but really it never really looked like Fnatic was in any danger of actually losing. There was some speculation that perhaps EDG looked kind of out of sorts, and there was some speculation that perhaps it was because of bad communication between the Korean imports and the Chinese core of the team. But that is interesting because they were able to perhaps get around that at at MSI, so I wonder why that was happening. Finally, we watched Skt versus Ahq. Westor solo killed Faker in Game 3, but the first two games were really not too close. The last game was a bit slower and even looked like Ahq might actually be able to take the win, but Skt were able to clinch it. The reason this game was so close, Game 3 was so close, was because Skt kind of pulled a Samsung White from previous year and didn't really pick any wave clear, but they were actually still able to make it work just because I think of a difference in the quality of the teams. So, that moves us into our semi-finals. Both of our semi-finals, you'll see, are EU versus Korea, so we have Origin versus Skt and Fnatic versus Ku. So the Origin versus Skt semi-final, Game 1 was a bit of a top camp and a bit of a top gap, really, between Soaz and Maren. So Easyhoon was in for this game on his Azir. So this game was a very close game, actually, and it actually went over 40 minutes. Niels' Tristana was fantastic. Niels was really playing out of his mind, but Maren's Fiora was more fantastic, so to speak, and unfortunately OG was let down a little bit by Amazing's lackluster performance on Evelynn. So, Game 2 started a bit close, however, Skt took over in the mid-game with a whole bunch of really strong skirmishing and team fighting. So, they were also able to secure 5 Drakes, which, remember, in 2015 was kind of like Elder Drake now, similar sort of situation. Easyhoon was again in this game on his Orianna. So, Game 3, Faker comes in on his Rise. The early game was also close, however, once again, Skt would do their normal MO of taking over in mid-game skirmishes. Faker's Rise was really popping off this game, and it was strongly supported by Maren's Rumble. So out of this series, only Game 1 really looked like Skt might be taking a loss, but the next two games were very much Skt favoured. So that's a 3-0 for Skt, and they remain undefeated at the tournament, because you'll remember they went 6-0 in groups. So our second semi-final was Ku versus Fnatic. So, Game 1 started very strong for Fnatic. Raynova was strong in his Rek'Sai, and I believe he secured first blood, and Febiven was also playing a really good game of LeBlanc. However, the game turned around with a late game team fight, as Ku had picked quite a good scaling comp, and it kind of ran over Fnatic's more early game comp, which they had not managed to get a big enough lead on. So, Game 2 was much less close. Smeb was solo killing Huni, and Kuro's Veigar and Praise Callisto were really doing good work. Mid-game teamfights went to Ku. Fnatic managed to delay and almost about to come back, but one more lost teamfight spelled the end of the game. So that was a very Ku-favoured game. It just kind of took a little bit longer than you might expect. And then Game 3 turned into a little bit of a stomp off Smeb's Hecarim play and some really great insects from Hojin. Hojin was really good in that final game, making some fantastic plays on his Lee Sin. So, off the back of these two series, we'd have an all-Korea final of Skt versus Ku, and that final would be played in Berlin. So, Skt versus Ku. In Game 1, Skt would get the better of a whole bunch of very early small skirmishes, with Faker's Caston and Mara's Rumble doing a lot of good work. Skt would chain this into winning teamfight after teamfight and taking the game, so very much an Skt-favoured first game, and it didn't really look too close. Game 2 started with a crazy level 1 dive, which went Ku's way. Faker solo killed Kuro and Lulu, though. This game was much slower than Game 1, with small skirmishes going back and forth. However, Skt would take a couple of team fights in a row and smash Ku's base to take the win. And this was really crazy because it kind of looked like the game was, up in the air, and then suddenly Skt is just winning the game. And this was a common theme for Worlds 2015, where it's going back and forth and then Skt wins. So Game 3, on the other hand, though, was a little bit of a contrast. It would start absolutely terribly for Skt. They gave up 4 kills at about 4 minutes into the game in a skirmish, just going in one by one. So this would snowball into a couple more kills on Faker Faker, and a few more picks. So the Ku team comp in this game was perfect for the style, where they had Thresh, Ashe, and Lee Sin, which is a really good core of a pick comp, and Hojin's Lee Sin was really clean, which definitely helped. Hojin's Lee Sin was insecting people all around the place and getting lots of picks. So SKT actually almost managed to make a comeback, and they probably would have made a comeback against a lesser team, because SKT was fantastic this tournament and in this game, but unfortunately their comeback, or unfortunately for them, their comeback was finished off by Smebs Fiora and Chorus Kasten. So this notably was the only loss for SKT this entire tournament to the Ku Tigers. And then finally, we have Game 4, where Faker's Rise became just extremely fed, and he just started to run over people. Multiple times he would win 2v1s or just 1v1 people and destroy them. So SKT, off the back of it, started to win skirmish after skirmish, and then finally a big team fight in Ku's base, and huge damage coming out of Faker's Rise would secure the Summoner's Cup for SKT. Notably, in this final series, Faker was in for all 4 games, so he gets doesn't have to share any of the credit for the finals with Easy Hoon. So just a couple of things to discuss, or just a thing to discuss quickly before we get into the game recommendations, is that you might be tricked into thinking that KT, was one of the worst teams at this Worlds, because they got knocked out in the quarterfinals. However, KT was probably the 3rd best team in Worlds in 2015, as it was only KT and Ku that were. So KT took a game off Ku, and then Ku took a game off SKT, and no one else was able to take games off Ku in best of fives. Fnatic was looking very, very strong. In fact, Fnatic was probably the best non-Korean team at Worlds, and they got 3-0'd by Ku. So what this basically means, and I know it's a little bit, perhaps a little bit reductionist, but really KT was, I think, definitely a much better team than Fnatic at this World Championship, and so it is a little bit unfortunate that they got the very unlucky draw to draw into Ku. But yeah, so I would say that kind of looking back at this Worlds, the top 3 teams were definitely SKT, Ku, and KT, which coincidentally were all the Korean teams. So this really marks the height of just total Korean dominance of the World Championship. The top 3 teams were all Korean, and it wasn't really that close. In fact, no team even took a game off. No non-Korean team took a game off a Korean team in a best of 5 here. So really, really strong dominance from Korea. So now let's just finish off with some recommendations for you guys. So the first game I'd recommend is Fnatic versus IG, the very first game of Worlds. This game is just a satisfying game if you're a Fnatic fan. They were able to force IG to surrender with some absolute dominance. And then speaking of being a Fnatic fan, the next one I'd recommend is Fnatic versus EDG Game 3. So this is just once again Fnatic just dominating Chinese teams at this tournament. Then I would recommend to you Ku versus KT, the first game. It's just really fun to see Someday pop off on his Darius, particularly if you are a fan or aware of him in his current capacity as an NA top laner. It was really fun to see him on top of his game at Worlds. Then we have Origin versus Skt Game 1, and I recommend this because it was one of the games which Skt really looked challenged, and it was quite satisfying to see Origin almost do it. So I would recommend that one. Then finally, I would recommend to you, not quite finally, one more game. So I'd recommend you Skt versus Ahq Game 3. Once again, it's fun to see Skt get challenged a little bit, and it's fun to see Westor almost carry on his fizz. And in the final game I'd recommend to you, well, final 2 games, is Ku versus Skt Game 3 and 4. So it's interesting to see Skt finally lose a game. It's interesting to see how many things have to go wrong for them to actually lose. They entered 4 kills at 4 minutes into the game, and they almost still came back. So definitely Game 3 is cool to see them actually finally lose a game. And then Game 4, once again, I'm always recommending the final game of Worlds, because I really do think that it is fun to watch Skt, to watch Faker's Rise dominate, and watch Skt raise their 2nd trophy. So yeah, that is the 2015 Season 5 World Championship summarized. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you have a great day.